Welcome to Marple Whispers. I'm Sean. Tell me, where are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? I'd love to know. Share it in the comments along with how you liked the story. I reply to every single one of you. Now let's step into the mystery, in the heart of Marrakesh. Beneath the golden glow of silk lanterns, a lavish wedding night turns deadly. The charming groom, Sir Basil Trent, collapses mid-toast, poisoned in front of his stunned guests. Among whispers of secrets, betrayal and forbidden knowledge, only one sharp-eyed detective notices the subtle clues hiding in plain sight. Miss Marple must unravel a web of deceit, where trust is lethal and the smallest gestures reveal the killer. Who dared to turn a night of celebration into a fatal trap? Chapter 1. An Invitation to Exotic. Miss Jane Marple had always maintained that nothing truly important ever happened because of scenery. Yet she could not deny that Marrakesh was remarkably distracting. The Marrakesh Palace Hotel rose from its gardens like something remembered from a dream. Arched corridors washed in amber light, tiled floors patterned with patient geometry, and palm trees that rustled as though exchanging confidential remarks. She had come at the persistent urging of Lady Honoria Vane, for the air, Jane, and a change of faces. Lady Honoria, who possessed both a generous income and a dangerous enthusiasm for novelty, had been determined that Miss Marple should not spend another winter in St. Mary Mead. And so Miss Marple now sat in the palace courtyard, a small, neat figure in pale lace, knitting steadily while the world paraded before her. Experience had taught her that people, when removed from familiar surroundings, often revealed themselves more clearly. At a nearby table, Sir Basil Trent was holding court. He was a tall man, silver-haired, with the commanding ease of someone accustomed to being listened to. His laughter carried too far, his compliments lingered too long. Miss Marple noticed how guests leaned in despite themselves. As though drawn by a gravity they did not entirely trust. Sir Basil's wife sat beside him, Lady Celeste Trent. She was very beautiful, with dark eyes and a composure so perfect it seemed practiced. She smiled when expected, spoke when addressed, and kept her hands folded in her lap. Miss Marple, glancing up briefly from her knitting, thought of village girls who had learned early the usefulness of silence. Not far away, Major Hugh Linton stood smoking beneath an archway. He was a military man to the core. Upright posture, clipped movements, eyes that measured distances unconsciously. Sir Basil's business partner, Miss Marple recalled, the sort of man who believed loyalty was a virtue, even when it was inconvenient. There were others too. Madame Roche, a French journalist with sharp features and sharper questions, sketched idly in a notebook while watching Sir Basil with open interest. Dr. Farouk, the hotel's resident physician, passed among the guests with professional courtesy, pausing to exchange pleasantries in a voice too smooth to be wholly reassuring. Miss Marple counted them quietly, as she might once have counted churchgoers in St. Mary Mead. Patterns formed themselves, those, as they always did. Lady Honoria arrived in a flutter of scarves and excitement. "Jane, darling, isn't it marvellous? So dramatic. You can hardly believe one is still in the same world." "Oh, I think it's very much the same world," Miss Marple replied gently. "Only people feel freer to behave badly when they think no one knows them." Lady Honoria laughed and swept off, already distracted by a new acquaintance. As evening approached, lanterns were lit throughout the courtyard, their glow softening faces and deepening shadows. A formal dinner was announced in honour of Sir Basil, who was said to be celebrating the successful conclusion of a most profitable expedition. Miss Marple accepted her invitation with polite interest. Celebrations, she knew, had an unfortunate tendency to mark endings rather than beginnings. As she folded her knitting and rose, she observed Sir Basil's smile widen as guests congratulated him. Yet there was a flicker in his eyes, something alert, almost wary. A man who had won something, perhaps, and was watching carefully to see who resented it. Miss Marple followed the others toward the dining hall, unaware that before the night was over, Marrakesh Palace would exchange its air of enchantment for one of quiet dread, and that she, once again, would be called upon to notice what others overlooked. Chapter 2. Death Beneath the Lanterns. The dining hall of the Marrakesh Palace Hotel had been transformed for the evening into something both intimate and theatrical. Silk lanterns, suspended at varying heights, cast a honeyed glow over the long table, softening sharp features and lending even the most commonplace expression a suggestion of mystery. Beyond the open arches, the night air drifted in, carrying with it the distant rhythm of drums from the city, steady, insistent, like a pulse. Miss Marple took her seat with mild interest. She had been placed midway down the table, a position she rather preferred. One saw more from the middle, she had always thought, and was less likely to be drawn into conversation one would later regret. Sir Basil Trent presided at the head with unmistakable satisfaction. He wore a cream dinner jacket and a silk cravat of deep blue, the colour chosen, Miss Marple suspected, to suggest both refinement and adventure. He looked every inch the successful man, confident, prosperous, and faintly amused by the admiration of others. Lady Celeste sat to his right. Under the lantern light, her beauty was almost unreal, as though carefully composed for effect. She spoke little, but when she did, her voice was low and controlled. Miss Marple noticed that she did not eat much, though she touched each dish politely, as if marking time. The dinner progressed through a series of rich and fragrant courses. Conversation rose and fell. Madame Roche asked pointed questions about Sir Basil's travels, to which he replied with elaborate charm, never quite answering what was asked. Major Linton listened in silence, his expression growing more rigid with each glass of wine Sir Basil accepted. Miss Marple, meanwhile, was occupied with smaller matters. She observed how Sir Basil declined the wine offered by the waiter halfway through the meal. "No more for me," he said cheerfully. "I prefer something lighter tonight." The waiter hesitated, then suggested mint tea, a house speciality. Sir Basil agreed readily. Lady Celeste leaned forward. "Use the honey, Basil," she said softly. "The one you like." She gestured to a small jar placed beside her plate, a thick glass container with a gilt lid. Sir Basil smiled indulgently. "My wife knows my tastes better than anyone," he remarked, with a hint of proprietorship that made Miss Marple's knitting fingers pause, though her face remained placid. The tea arrived steaming, its fresh scent cutting through the heavier aromas of the meal. Lady Celeste lifted the honey jar herself and poured a generous spoonful into Sir Basil's cup, stirring slowly. The movement was unhurried, almost graceful. Miss Marple noticed two things at once. First, that the waiter did not touch the cup again. Second, that Sir Basil did not thank his wife. Music drifted in from the courtyard as dessert was served, light pastries dusted with sugar. Sir Basil pushed his plate aside and rose to his feet, glass in hand. "If you will indulge me," he began, "I should like to say a few words." Chairs shifted. Conversation stilled. Sir Basil thrived on such moments. "I have travelled far," he said, his voice carrying easily, "and I have returned with treasures. Not only objects of history, but the satisfaction of achievement. None of it would have been possible without courage, determination, and the loyalty of certain individuals present tonight." His gaze flicked briefly toward Major Linton, then away. Miss Marple watched his face closely. She had seen many men deliver speeches in village halls, often far less polished, and she knew how easily confidence could slip. Sir Basil raised his cup. "To success," he declared. He took a sip. The change was subtle at first, a faint hesitation, as though the taste were not quite as expected. Then his brows drew together. He lowered the cup slowly. "My dear," he said, turning toward Lady Celeste, "this tea—" The words faltered. A curious greyness spread across his features, draining the colour with alarming speed. His hand flew to his throat. The cup slipped from his fingers, shattering on the tiled floor. For a moment, no one moved. It was as though the lantern-lit room had frozen in disbelief. Then Sir Basil staggered. Miss Marple was on her feet before she quite realised it, though she did not push forward. She had learned that panic rarely improved matters. Sir Basil collapsed heavily, the chair behind him clattering to the floor. Lady Celeste cried out, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the stunned silence. Guests surged forward. Someone shouted for a doctor. Dr. Farouk was already there, kneeling beside the fallen man, fingers pressed to his neck, his face grave and intent. He loosened Sir Basil's collar, murmuring instructions in a calm, professional tone. Miss Marple remained where she was, her eyes moving steadily from face to face. Major Linton stood rigid, his knuckles white against the back of his chair. Madame Roche watched with an expression of fierce concentration, as though committing every detail to memory. Lady Celeste knelt beside her husband, her hands trembling violently now, her composure utterly gone. "He was well," she kept saying. "He was perfectly well." Dr. Farouk looked up at last. He shook his head once. "I am very sorry," he said quietly. "He is dead." The words settled over the room like ash. Someone began to sob. Another guest crossed himself hurriedly. The musicians in the courtyard fell silent, as if the night itself had drawn back. Miss Marple sat down slowly. She felt very old all at once, and very certain. Death, she reflected, had a way of revealing truths far more efficiently than conversation ever did. The authorities were summoned at once. While they were awaited, Dr. Farouk insisted the body not be disturbed. Sir Basil lay where he had fallen, his face oddly calm now, as though the force that animated it had simply withdrawn. Miss Marple noticed the broken cup on the floor. The tea had soaked into the grout, leaving a dark stain. No one seemed inclined to clean it. Lady Celeste was led away gently by Lady Honoria, who murmured comforts with an air of well-practised sympathy. As she passed, Miss Marple observed that Lady Celeste's eyes were dry. The local police arrived with commendable speed. Questions were asked, statements taken. The word poison was spoken in low voices, then repeated with greater confidence. Miss Marple answered politely when addressed, offering nothing beyond what she had plainly seen. She was careful to mention the tea, the honey, the fact that Sir Basil had refused wine. Such details, she knew, were easily overlooked in moments of excitement. Later, as the guests were dismissed to their rooms, Miss Marple returned to her own with measured steps. She sat by the window for some time, listening to the distant city sounds resume, indifferent to tragedy. Beneath the lanterns, a man had died. and somewhere in that beautifully arranged evening, a deliberate hand had been at work. Chapter 3. Whispers in the courtyard morning came softly to the Marrakesh palace, as though reluctant to disturb the events of the previous night. Sunlight filtered through carved latticework, breaking itself into fragments of gold upon the tiled floors. Birds sang with determined cheerfulness in the palm trees. Entirely indifferent to the fact that a man had died beneath the lanterns only hours before. Miss Marple, who had slept very little, was awake early. She sat by the window of her room, hands folded neatly in her lap, observing the courtyard below. Tragedy, she reflected, did not halt routine, it merely altered its tone. People still breakfasted, still strolled, still spoke, but with lowered voices and glances that darted like startled birds. Sir Basil Trent's death had already acquired a variety of explanations, none of them particularly convincing. The police had requested that the guests remain at the hotel for the present. This was accepted with mixed reactions. Irritation from those who disliked inconvenience, excitement from those who enjoyed drama, and visible unease from those who feared attention. Miss Marple dressed with care and descended to the courtyard for breakfast. She chose a small table in the shade, her knitting placed conspicuously beside her. Few things, she had learned, encouraged conversation like the appearance of harmless occupation. Lady Honoria arrived shortly after, flushed and agitated. "My dear Jane," she whispered, seating herself at once, "this is all so dreadful. Poison, they say. Actual poison. One expects it in novels, not at breakfast." "Yes," said Miss Marple mildly, "though one might argue that novels simply reflect what people are capable of." Lady Honoria shuddered and reached for her coffee. Across the courtyard, Major Hugh Linton paced slowly near the fountain. He looked as though he had not slept at all. His movements were precise, almost mechanical, but his eyes betrayed strain. From time to time, he glanced toward the entrance of the hotel, as though expecting or dreading someone's arrival. Miss Marple noted this carefully. Dr. Farouk appeared soon after, greeting guests with professional gravity. He paused at several tables, accepting condolences with measured nods. When he reached Miss Marple, he inclined his head politely. "A most distressing occurrence, miss," he said. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "Sir Basil appeared in excellent spirits only moments before." "Yes," Dr. Farouk replied, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "The onset was remarkably swift." "And unusual?" Miss Marple prompted gently. He hesitated. "Let us say, not typical of natural causes." Miss Marple thanked him and returned to her knitting. The admission, though guarded, was quite sufficient. Madame Roche entered the courtyard shortly thereafter, notebook already in hand. She seated herself near Miss Marple without invitation. "You saw everything, yes?" she said briskly. "These things, people always miss details." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "I saw what anyone might have seen, I'm sure." Madame Roche's lips tightened. "Sir Basil had many enemies, powerful ones. You know he refused to return certain artifacts, sacred objects. Some people consider that theft." "People consider many things theft," Miss Marple replied calmly, "including affections and inheritances." Madame Roche studied her sharply, then laughed. "You are more observant than you appear, Miss Marple." Madame Roche scribbled the name, then rose. "I shall speak with you again." Miss Marple watched her go. Journalists, she reflected, were rather like village gossips with better stationery. Her attention turned then to Lady Celeste, who emerged hesitantly from the hotel entrance. She was dressed in black, though not morning attire, too soon for that. Her face was pale, her eyes ringed with shadows. Several guests turned to look. She shrank slightly under the attention. She did not approach the breakfast tables, but moved instead toward a secluded bench near the orange trees. Miss Marple waited a moment, then gathered her knitting and rose. "My dear Lady Celeste," she said gently, as though addressing a nervous parishioner, "may I sit with you for a moment?" Lady Celeste looked up, startled. For a brief instant, something like fear crossed her face. Then she nodded. "Of course." They sat in silence for a while. Miss Marple did not hurry. She knew from long experience that people spoke more freely when not pressed. "At St. Mary Mead," Miss Marple began at last, "we once lost a gentleman at a church fete. Very sudden. People said at first it was excitement. Too much heat, too much cake. But of course it was not." Lady Celeste's hands twisted together in her lap. "My husband was not ill," she said abruptly. "He was strong, careful. He trusted no one." "Yet he trusted you," Miss Marple said softly. Lady Celeste's breath caught. "Yes." There was a long pause. "I did not pour the tea," Lady Celeste said suddenly, almost fiercely. "I only added the honey. Basil always preferred it that way." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Husbands' habits are well known to their wives." Lady Celeste looked at her then, really looked at her. "You think I killed him?" Miss Marple shook her head. "I think nothing yet. I only observe." Tears welled in Lady Celeste's eyes, though they did not fall. "Basil had secrets," she whispered. "Terrible ones. He made enemies everywhere. If someone wished him dead, there are many who might have done it." "That may be so," Miss Marple replied. "But usually, my dear, the simplest path is the one taken." Footsteps approached. Major Linton stood a short distance away, his face taut. "Lady Celeste," he said stiffly, "the police wish to speak with you again." She rose obediently, her composure restored with effort. As she passed Miss Marple, their eyes met briefly. There was no gratitude there, only calculation. Miss Marple returned to her table, her thoughts busy. Later that morning, she encountered one of the waiters who had served dinner the previous night. He hovered uncertainly near her table, clearly anxious. "You wish to ask something, miss," she said kindly. He nodded. "The tea, madam? I was told to bring it, but I did not sweeten it." "No," said Miss Marple. "I noticed." He lowered his voice. "The honey jar. It was not from the kitchen. It was placed on the table before dinner." "By whom?" "I do not know, madam." Miss Marple thanked him. That was quite enough. As the sun climbed higher, the courtyard filled once more with murmurs. Speculation layered upon speculation. Yet, beneath it all, Miss Marple sensed a tightening of nerves, a drawing in of secrets. Sir Basil Trent, for all his confidence, had not died by chance. And as Miss Marple folded her knitting and gazed at the spotless tiles where bloodless death had struck, she felt certain of one thing. Someone in Marrakesh Palace was not merely afraid of the truth, but waiting for it to be uncovered. Chapter 4. A Familiar Pattern. By the fourth morning, the Marrakesh Palace had acquired a curious air of restraint, as though the building itself were holding its breath. The easy laughter of tourists had vanished. Conversations broke off when footsteps approached. Doors were closed more carefully than before. Death, Miss Marple reflected, did not merely intrude, it rearranged. She sat in the smaller reading room, overlooking the inner garden, sunlight falling in measured squares upon the carpet. Before her lay not a book, but a neat arrangement of thoughts. Miss Marple had long ago learned that clues, like stitches in knitting, made sense only when seen in proper sequence. Sir Basil Trent's death was swift. Too swift. The doctor had said as much. Poison then, but poison chosen with knowledge. Not something common or accidental, but precise. And precision, Miss Marple knew, was rarely the work of impulse. She closed her eyes briefly and pictured the dinner again, as vividly as if it was still unfolding beneath the lanterns. The smell of mint, the clink of china, Sir Basil's refusal of wine, that, she felt, was the hinge upon which everything turned. Wine would have been served to many, tea only to one. A poisoner with the slightest intelligence would choose the smallest possible circle of exposure. It was a method Miss Marple had encountered before, in St. Mary Mead, of all places, when a timid woman had poisoned a single cup of cocoa, meant only for her tyrannical brother-in-law. The parallels were striking. Miss Marple rose and made her way into the garden. The orange trees were in fruit, their blossoms lending the air a deceptive sweetness. She seated herself on a stone bench and waited. It was not long before Dr. Farouk appeared, walking slowly, hands clasped behind his back. When he saw Miss Marple, he paused. "You are thinking very intently, miss," he said. "I hope not unkindly." "Oh, no," Miss Marple replied. "Only practically." He smiled faintly and sat beside her. "The results of the preliminary examination are quite clear," he said. "Sir Basil died from a fast-acting toxin. Rare, organic. One would need familiarity to obtain or recognize it." "Something he might have encountered during his travels?" Miss Marple suggested. "Yes, or collected." Dr. Farouk regarded her more closely now. "You are remarkably perceptive." "I have lived a long time," said Miss Marple. "One notices repetitions." He inclined his head and took his leave. Miss Marple's thoughts returned immediately to Lady Celeste. A young wife, a wealthy husband, a marriage formed quickly, she suspected, and maintained with difficulty. Such arrangements, she knew, were not uncommon in villages. Though the scale differed, the emotions did not. Later that afternoon she encountered Major Hugh Linton in the corridor outside the billiard room. He looked surprised and faintly uncomfortable to see her. "Major Linton," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "might I trouble you for a moment?" He hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "You worked closely with Sir Basil," she continued, "for many years, I believe." "Yes. And yet you seemed strained at dinner." His jaw tightened. Sir Basil was not an easy man. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Successful men rarely are." "There were disagreements," he said shortly. "Business ones." "About artifacts?" Miss Marple asked. He looked sharply at her. "That is a dangerous word." "Only to those who fear it," she replied. He said nothing more, but as he turned away, Miss Marple observed the faint sheen of sweat at his temples. Guilt, she thought, or fear, but not perhaps the kind that killed. That evening, she returned once more to the dining hall. The table had been cleared, the lanterns were unlit, yet the scene remained vivid in her mind. She paced slowly to the spot where Sir Basil had fallen. The stain from the spilled tea had been cleaned, but not perfectly. A faint shadow remained between the tiles. Miss Marple knelt with some difficulty and examined the area closely. There was no residue, of course. That was not what she sought. Rather, she studied the pattern of breakage from the shattered cup. It had fallen straight down, not flung away. His strength had left him suddenly, not gradually. She straightened with a sigh. Yes, that confirmed it. Later, as dusk gathered, Miss Marple requested tea in the lounge. The waiter brought it promptly. "Honey?" he asked. "No, thank you," said Miss Marple. "I never take it." "But Sir Basil always did," the waiter said, then stopped short, embarrassed. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Yes, one becomes known by one's preferences." As the waiter departed, Lady Celeste entered the Ego lounge. She paused when she saw Miss Marple, then approached hesitantly. "You wished to speak with me?" she asked. "I thought it might be kind," Miss Marple replied. "These things are easier discussed quietly." Lady Celeste sat opposite her. The distance between them was small, but emotionally it might have been miles. "You are very calm," Lady Celeste said suddenly. "I have seen much sorrow," Miss Marple replied, "and much wrongdoing. Often they are closely linked." Lady Celeste's lips trembled. "Basil was changing," she said. "He planned to send me away quietly, without scandal." "That would have left you disadvantaged," Miss Marple said. "Yes. And you knew his habits intimately." Lady Celeste's hands tightened around her handbag. "Every wife does." "Not every wife," Miss Marple corrected gently, "knows precisely what her husband consumes, and when, and what he refuses." Silence stretched between them. "Basil trusted no one," Lady Celeste said at last, "except himself." "And you," Miss Marple said softly. Lady Celeste stood abruptly. "You think me a murderer." "I think," said Miss Marple, rising slowly, "that patterns repeat themselves, in villages, in cities, even in palaces." Lady Celeste stared at her, then turned and left. Miss Marple watched her go, her expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. She did not enjoy being right about such things. As night fell once more over Marrakesh Palace, Miss Marple returned to her room and took up her knitting. The pattern was nearly complete now. Only a few stitches remained uncertain, but the shape was unmistakable. Sir Basil Trent had not been killed by chance, nor by distant enemies. He had been undone by familiarity. And Miss Marple, gazing out at the moonlit courtyard, felt quietly certain that the truth, like all familiar patterns, would soon reveal itself in full. Chapter 5. The Mask Slips. The afternoon heat lay heavily over the Marrakesh Palace, pressing against walls and tempers alike. Even the fountains seemed to murmur more softly, as though conscious that their usual gaiety was no longer appropriate. Miss Marple, seated once again in the shaded lounge, felt the atmosphere keenly. When secrets approached exposure, she had observed, people grew either very silent or very careless. She was knitting, of course. The wool slid steadily through her fingers, each stitch exact, familiar, and comforting. It was during such moments of apparent idleness that Miss Marple's mind worked best. The police investigation had reached a frustrating stage. No strangers had entered the dining hall. No obvious trace of poison had been found in the kitchen. Every guest possessed an alibi of sorts, woven from half-truths and convenient assumptions. Yet Miss Marple felt no impatience. She knew that guilt, like poorly mended fabric, revealed itself under gentle pressure. That pressure, she decided, must now be applied. She rose and made her way toward the smaller courtyard near the east wing, quiet, rarely used, and ideal for private conversation. Lady Celeste had been spending much of her time there, walking slowly beneath the arches, her movements subdued, as though she were rehearsing grief rather than inhabiting it. Miss Marple approached her with deliberate gentleness. "My dear Lady Celeste," she said, "may I trouble you for a few minutes?" Lady Celeste stopped walking. She looked thinner than she had days before, the sharp lines of her beauty more pronounced. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the archway behind them. "If this is another interrogation—" "Oh, no," Miss Marple interrupted softly. Nothing so official. Merely a conversation between two women." After a moment's hesitation, Lady Celeste inclined her head. They seated themselves on a stone bench, warmed by the sun. "I once knew a girl," Miss Marple began, "who married a man much older than herself. He was generous, admired, and entirely convinced of his own indispensability. She believed, at first, that gratitude would grow into affection. It rarely does." Lady Celeste's fingers tightened in her lap. "You speak as though you knew my husband." "I know the type," Miss Marple replied. "They appear impressive to the world, and oppressive in private." Lady Celeste's composure wavered. "Basil was not cruel," she said quickly. "He was demanding." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "demanding loyalty, obedience, silence." Lady Celeste looked away. The courtyard was very still. "He was going to leave you," Miss Marple continued quietly. "Arrange matters so that you would disappear from his life without inconvenience." Lady Celeste's breath caught. "How could you know that?" "Because he had begun to behave like a man tying loose ends," Miss Marple said. "Refusing wine, controlling his habits, altering documents. Men who fear betrayal become meticulous." Tears spilled at last, sudden and unrestrained. "He told me the night before," Lady Celeste whispered, "that I was a mistake. That he would be generous, of course, but I would be sent away. Discreetly." Miss Marple waited. "I had nothing," Lady Celeste went on. "No family of my own. No position without him. I was an ornament he had grown tired of." "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. "I have seen that happen before." Lady Celeste covered her face with her hands. For several moments she did not speak. When she did, her voice was very low. "He showed me the toxin himself, months ago. He was proud of it. Said it was used by desert tribes, swift, undetectable. He kept it among his collections." Miss Marple nodded. "He would have considered it harmless knowledge. I did not plan it at first," Lady Celeste said desperately. "I only thought of escape. But when he refused the wine, when I saw the tea, it was as though the moment chose itself." "You placed the honey jar on the table," Miss Marple said. "Yes, and you ensured no one else would touch it." "Yes." The admission hung in the air, fragile and irrevocable. "He trusted me," Lady Celeste whispered. "That was the cruelest part." Miss Marple regarded her with deep seriousness. "Trust, my dear, is often misused by those who assume it is indestructible." Lady Celeste straightened suddenly. "You will tell them?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "but I wished you to tell me first. Confession, when voluntary, retains a measure of dignity." Lady Celeste gave a short, bitter laugh. "Dignity! Basil took mine long ago." Footsteps sounded in the archway. Major Linton appeared, stopping abruptly when he saw them together. "Am I interrupting?" he asked stiffly. "No," said Miss Marple. "In fact, you may find this conversation most relevant." Lady Celeste rose. Her face had changed. Stripped of its practised elegance, it now held a stark, resolute calm. "I did it," she said clearly. "I poisoned my husband." Major Linton stared at her, shock warring with something like relief. "The police must be informed," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "They are already waiting." Lady Celeste turned to Miss Marple one last time. "You were kind," she said. "I did not expect that." "Kindness and truth are not enemies," Miss Marple replied. "They are simply uncomfortable companions." Lady Celeste walked away, her steps steady now, as though the burden of concealment had been heavier than that of guilt. Later, as the authorities led Lady Celeste from the hotel, the guests gathered in subdued clusters. Whispers rippled through the courtyard, not of shock, but of grim understanding. The explanation, once revealed, seemed inevitable. Madame Roche scribbled furiously in her notebook. Dr. Farouk spoke quietly with the police, his earlier suspicions confirmed. Major Linton stood apart, staring into the fountain as though hoping the water might erase what he had witnessed. Miss Marple returned to the lounge and resumed her knitting. Her hands trembled slightly at first, then steadied. Lady Honoria approached her, pale and shaken. "Jane, how did you know?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because people are much the same everywhere. Fear, resentment, opportunity. They weave together in familiar ways." Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the tiles. The Marrakesh palace exhaled, its secret at last exposed. Miss Marple tied off her final stitch and folded her work. The pattern was complete now. Tragic, yes, but unmistakable. And as she gazed thoughtfully toward the courtyard, she reflected that the most dangerous mask was not the one worn for society, but the one worn at home when no one was supposed to be watching. Chapter 6. Justice in a Foreign Land. The She-Dog morning after Lady Celeste's confession, the Marrakesh palace seemed to breathe more freely, though the air remained heavy with the memory of the previous days. Guests moved about with quieter steps, their conversations hushed and measured. Servants whispered in corners, their hands busy, yet their eyes alert. Even the fountains, which usually sang without concern, appeared to murmur in solemn rhythm. Death had left its mark, and truth, though revealed, had brought with it a certain solemnity that was impossible to ignore. Miss Marple, as always, began the day early. She sat at the window of her room, knitting quietly, the sunlight reflecting off the polished tiles below. She observed the comings and goings in the courtyard with patient interest. Already, the hotel had begun its routine as though nothing had happened, yet there was an undeniable shift in the pattern of movement. A subtle, almost imperceptible change that indicated unease and recognition. By mid-morning, the authorities arrived in greater number. Local police, aided by the hotel's security, took statements from everyone present. Dr. Farouk, ever precise, assisted in clarifying the medical aspects. Guests were asked to remain nearby, not as prisoners but as witnesses to a process that could not be hurried. Miss Marple observed silently, aware that the truth had already been exposed. The formalities were merely for appearances. Lady Celeste, now calm and composed, was escorted to a quiet room to provide a full statement. Her earlier tears were gone, replaced by a serene acceptance. Miss Marple had learned long ago that acceptance was the first step toward facing justice. Guilt alone often produced chaos. She watched as Lady Celeste walked past her, head held high, and noted the careful control in every movement. The woman had chosen her moment wisely, and the confession had spared the authorities unnecessary delays. Miss Marple took a leisurely stroll in the inner garden. She noted the hotel staff, who moved with a combination of curiosity and respect. The cook, who had prepared the dinner, appeared deeply relieved that the mystery had been solved. The maids whispered among themselves, careful to maintain discretion. It was clear that even in Marrakesh, the human fascination with scandal was universal. When she returned to the lounge, Major Hugh Linton was already seated. He appeared restless, occasionally glancing toward the door as if expecting news at any moment. Miss Marple approached him quietly. "Major Linton," she said, taking the chair opposite him, "you have done your best under trying circumstances. It is never easy when trust is betrayed, especially when one's friend becomes the victim. He looked up sharply. Do you think I failed? Not at all, Miss Marple replied calmly. You observed, you waited, and you responded when necessary. Sometimes that is all anyone can do. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. It is curious, he said, how close evil can be, and yet hidden in plain sight. Celeste, I never imagined. Miss Marple nodded. People are often disguised by their appearances, Major. It is the familiarity that conceals them most effectively. And it is also the familiarity that reveals them in the end. As they spoke, Dr. Farouk entered, carrying a small bundle of documents. The authorities have prepared everything for Lady Celeste's transfer. They will ensure that she is taken safely to the station. All the necessary statements and medical observations are compiled. There will be no confusion or delay. Miss Marple inclined her head. Excellent. Accuracy and clarity prevent mistakes. One cannot undo what is done incorrectly. Soon after, Lady Celeste emerged, escorted by 2 officers. She paused briefly, turning toward Miss Marple. Thank you, she said softly, for listening and for understanding. You made your choice, my dear, Miss Marple replied, and in doing so, you spared many from further suffering. That is a kind of justice too. The officers led Lady Celeste away, her steps steady, almost proud. Miss Marple watched until she was out of sight. Though a foreign land, she reflected, carried its own procedures and constraints, human nature remained consistent. Greed, fear, resentment, they were universal, and so were the consequences. Afterward, the remaining guests gathered in the courtyard. The conversations were subdued, tinged with relief and lingering apprehension. Madame Roche, who had been furiously taking notes for days, finally closed her notebook. You saw it all unfold, she said to Miss Marple. How did you know? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I noticed patterns. People reveal themselves in repetition, in the small things. It is remarkable how often the truth waits quietly for someone to recognize it. Major Linton approached, nodding toward Miss Marple. You were right all along, he said. The smallest details, the tea, the honey, the gestures, they made the story clear to you before anyone else. Miss Marple, ever modest, shrugged gently. Details are the threads that hold the fabric together. Remove enough, and everything unravels. One simply needs patience to observe. Lady Honoria joined them, still somewhat flustered. I never imagined something like this could happen here, and yet it seems inevitable in retrospect. Indeed, Miss Marple said softly. When one understands human nature, tragedies are rarely accidents. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple walked once more through the gardens. The orange trees cast long shadows, and the fountain murmured with quiet persistence. She thought of Sir Basil Trent, not with affection, but with the calm recognition that life, in its unpredictability, leaves many lessons behind. It was then that she noticed the subtle changes in the staff's movements. They were no longer anxious or tentative. There was a quiet orderliness now, as though the revelation of truth had restored balance. Miss Marple noted this with approval. A place cannot function under deception, not for long. Later, as evening fell, the courtyard emptied of guests and the palace lights glimmered against the darkening sky. Miss Marple sat on her bench one last time before retiring. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of desert jasmine. The events of the past days had been extraordinary, yet she reflected calmly that they were merely examples of human behavior under pressure: greed, fear, ambition, and survival. She took up her knitting again, fingers moving deftly, but her mind remained alert. she had observed enough to understand the full story. Sir Basil Trent had been undone not merely by poison, but by his own habits and trust. Lady Celeste had acted from fear, desperation, and knowledge carefully obtained over time. And justice, though enacted in a foreign land, had been served through a combination of confession and evidence. As Miss Marple looked out at the quiet courtyard, she felt the familiar sense of closure that always followed her interventions. The palace, though still elegant and imposing, had regained a measure of calm. Yet she knew that human nature was unchanging. Elsewhere, another secret would grow in shadow, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. In Marrakesh, justice had been achieved. The murderer was accounted for, and Miss Marple, with her patient eyes and careful observations, had once more witnessed the subtle ways in which truth and consequence move through the lives of those who believe themselves cleverer than the world around them. As night descended over the Marrakesh palace, Miss Marple rose and prepared to retire, aware that her task, as always, had been to notice, to understand, and to allow the inevitable to unfold. Human nature, she mused, did not require a judge to impose justice, merely an attentive observer willing to see the patterns that others missed. And so, beneath the lanterns that once bore witness to death, the palace settled into a quiet, measured rhythm. Justice had been done. Yet, for Miss Marple, the most profound lesson remained unchanged. The human heart, whether in a village in England or a palace in Marrakesh, reveals itself inevitably through action, habit, and the smallest of details. Chapter 7. Homeward Thoughts. The Marrakesh palace had finally begun to return to its accustomed rhythm. Guests moved about with less tension. Laughter, though restrained, returned to the courtyards. And the staff no longer glanced nervously at each other while performing their duties. The events surrounding Sir Basil Trent's sudden death and Lady Celeste's confession seemed to have crystallized into a story that could be acknowledged without fear, though never entirely forgotten. Miss Marple, as always, was up early. The sun had just begun its slow climb over the ochre walls of the palace, casting long, slender shadows across the tiled floors. She dressed with her usual care, donning a simple gown and arranging her hat neatly, then stepped onto the balcony overlooking the inner garden. The orange trees swayed gently in the morning breeze, their blossoms scattering tiny petals across the pathways. The serenity of the scene contrasted sharply with the drama that had unfolded just days before. Yet it was precisely this calm that allowed reflection to take place. Lady Honoria joined her shortly after. Carrying a small parasol to shield herself from the early sun, "Jane, you appear entirely unaffected," she said, a trace of admiration and exasperation in her voice. "I cannot imagine anyone remaining so composed after such events." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One grows accustomed to observing human nature, my dear. In time, one notices patterns, and patterns, once recognized, remove much of the surprise." Lady Honoria wrinkled her brow. "Still, murder in a palace, poison, a secret toxin, a confession. It is all far too dramatic for comfort." "Human behavior often is," Miss Marple replied gently. "It does not require exotic surroundings to be remarkable. The only difference here is that we are far from home, and the surroundings are unfamiliar. That, in itself, may encourage people to act more openly or carelessly." A distant bell rang from the hotel's reception area, signalling the arrival of a carriage. Miss Marple's attention was drawn naturally to the movement below. Soon Major Hugh Linton appeared in the courtyard, moving briskly toward her. His usual rigidity was softened by the knowledge that justice had been enacted, though traces of worry lingered in his posture. "Miss Marple," he said, nodding politely, "I wish to express my gratitude once more. Your observations were invaluable. Without them, I fear the truth might have remained hidden for far longer." "You are too kind, Major," Miss Marple replied. "I merely notice what others overlook. People themselves provide the most reliable evidence if one watches carefully." Major Linton hesitated, glancing toward the palace doors as though uncertain how to continue. "It is curious, isn't it?" he said finally, "how quickly appearances can mislead. Lady Celeste, one would never suspect. And yet, the signs were there. Subtle, almost imperceptible." "Exactly," Miss Marple agreed. "The smallest details are often the most telling. A hand gesture, a habit, a glance. They reveal more than words ever could." The carriage below stopped, and a young officer stepped out, ready to escort Lady Celeste to the authorities. Miss Marple watched the proceedings with quiet attention. Lady Celeste, once pale and trembling, now walked with deliberate calm, her posture reflecting an acceptance of what was to come. There was dignity in her movement, even in the face of inevitable consequence. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted, naturally, to Sir Basil Trent. He had been a man of ambition and knowledge, confident in his authority and accustomed to control. Yet his own habits, so carefully maintained, had provided the very instruments of his undoing. The irony, as Miss Marple noted, was not lost on her. Lady Honoria broke the silence. "Do you think she regrets it?" Miss Marple considered this for a moment. "Regret is a complicated thing. I suspect she regrets being caught more than the act itself. Fear and desperation often accompany decisions before conscience has time to intervene." The morning wore on, and the hotel staff moved more freely now, no longer constrained by suspicion or anxiety. Miss Marple observed them carefully, noting that the balance of the household had shifted subtly. People performed their duties with renewed attention. Perhaps the revelation of truth had provided a sense of closure, or perhaps it was simply relief that danger had passed. Later, Miss Marple made her way to the reading room, where a small number of guests had gathered. Madame Roche, ever observant, approached her briskly. "You must tell me," she said, voice low but insistent. "How did you know? Even the police were uncertain until the confession came." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Patterns are remarkably consistent, madame. People reveal themselves in subtle ways, the habits they trust, the routines they follow, the small discrepancies that go unnoticed by those who wish to be polite. One merely has to pay attention." Madame Roche's eyes narrowed, impressed despite herself. "And you observed all of that, simply from watching?" "Precisely," Miss Marple replied. "It is what human nature has taught me over the years. One sees repetition, and repetition reveals motive." By midday, arrangements were made for Miss Marple's departure from the Marrakesh palace. Her luggage was collected, and a carriage awaited to take her to the station where her journey back to England would begin. She paused for a final look at the courtyard, taking in the scene of tranquility that now replaced the tension of the previous days. The fountains sang quietly, the orange trees swayed gently, and sunlight danced across the patterned tiles, hiding no secrets beneath its warmth. Lady Honoria appeared at her side once more, brushing a stray curl from her forehead. "I cannot imagine returning home without reflecting on this adventure," she said. "It has been extraordinary." Miss Marple nodded. "Extraordinary indeed, and instructive. One learns that human nature remains consistent, no matter the geography or the luxury surrounding it." The carriage moved slowly through the palace gates, and Miss Marple watched as the grandeur of Marrakesh receded in the distance, The city, with its vibrant colours and chaotic streets, seemed to pulse with life and opportunity, entirely unconcerned with the events that had taken place in one of its most splendid hotels. During the journey to the airport, Miss Marple remained quietly reflective. She considered Sir Basil Trent's ambitions, Lady Celeste's desperation, and the various ways in which human trust could be exploited or betrayed. It was a familiar tableau, though set in unfamiliar surroundings. Human behaviour, she mused, did not change with latitude or climate. It only shifted in presentation. As the airport drew near, Miss Marple thought of St. Mary Mead. She would return to her village, to the familiar routines, the comforting patterns of small lives, and yet she knew that the lessons of Marrakesh would remain with her. The incident had reaffirmed what she had always known. That truth, though sometimes slow to surface, was never truly hidden from careful observation. The flight carried her homeward across vast deserts and seas, and she reflected on the peculiar way justice had been enacted. Lady Celeste would face consequences, certainly, but the moral weight of her confession and the inevitability of exposure had brought a measure of closure that no punishment could achieve alone. By the time the plane began its descent into English soil, Miss Marple's thoughts had returned to familiar territory, her village, her garden, her knitting, and the quiet satisfaction of having seen another human pattern through to its conclusion. Justice, she understood, was less a matter of law than of recognition. It required attention, patience, and the willingness to see beyond appearances. When she finally stepped onto English soil, the cool air of home felt both comforting and ordinary. The Marrakesh palace, with its exotic colours and dramatic history, was now behind her, but the lessons remained vividly present in her mind. Human nature, she thought, was universal, complex, flawed, and utterly fascinating. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the waiting taxi, her mind at ease. The mystery had been solved, justice enacted, and the palace returned to calm. Yet she knew, as she always did, that human behaviour would continue to surprise, challenge, and sometimes confound those who observed it. One could travel the world, encounter unfamiliar faces, and witness extraordinary events. But the essence of human nature remained constant, revealing itself through habit, hesitation, and the smallest of gestures. And so, as the taxi carried her towards St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. Another story had ended, another pattern revealed, and another testament to the constancy of human nature had been quietly observed. Marrakesh had been a foreign stage, but the players were all too familiar, and the lesson timeless.